Tennessee at Ohio State, that's the game I'm going to be at. That is Saturday night. That is 8 o'clock Eastern time. That is on ABC. This is a really treacherous spot. It's a treacherous spot, number one, because I'm going. And so in the past at Ohio State games, things haven't always been ideal when I've been there. However, I went to the Penn State game this year and they won. So I cannot solely be to blame. And I was not at the Michigan game, and you guys lost. So we've beaten down that narrative a little bit this year. But think about the path here. This is why it's treacherous. Tennessee plays Ohio State, so either one of them have a really tough challenge in round one. But the path, if any one of these teams wants to ultimately go and win a title, they got to beat each other. And then they got to go play Oregon. And then they probably draw Texas. And then they may have to deal with Georgia in the final, or a team that was good enough to beat Georgia, Notre Dame, Penn State, whoever. The path is insane. That's 4 games you got to go win. I mean, Tennessee's got to beat Ohio State, Oregon, let's say Texas, and let's say Georgia. What? Yeah, that's how the bracket works, because we have these wonderful auto bids. So we got a home favorite here, and we got Ohio State's favored by 7.5, by the way, if you're listening on podcast. I got a touchdown favorite at home in a playoff game, and to me, that home favorite of a touchdown plus has one big concern and one big question mark. So the offensive line for Ohio State is just an outright concern. Now, this is common knowledge, so much so that I think we have to restate it. Because, they lost Simmons, left tackle, Seth McLaughlin, who just won the Remington Award for being the best center in the country. What a story that is, by the way. Transfers from Bama because he can't snap the ball. They can't get the ball snapped, whichever side of that debate you fall on. Goes and wins the Remington. And he wins it over Bama's center. So, that's just a crazy dynamic in and of itself. The offensive line is a big question for Ohio State, and that's a concern, rather. The question is the quarterback position. So nobody has had big success running the ball on Tennessee. So I'm going to blindly take an assumption here, and that is I don't think with this beat-up offensive line, Ohio State is going to just pound away on the ground. I don't believe that's going to happen. They didn't do it against Michigan. I don't believe they'll do it here. Secondly, because of that, I think there is a lot of weight that falls on the shoulders of Will Howard here. And he's not a concern. I would list him more as the question. Will Howard's played big in moments before. He just didn't against Michigan. That's the freshest memory in everyone's mind, mine included, Ohio State fans included. And so a lot of that could go into how they called that game. I'm willing to listen to all that. But I'm just saying, absent all that, because that same coaching staff is going to be calling this game as well, so absent all that, Tennessee's better than Michigan. I know that's breaking news to a lot of folks, and I know Michigan gave you ample pushback that Saturday afternoon in Columbus, but this is a really, really good Tennessee team here. They're not going to give you a lot. And I don't think that you're going to run the ball incredibly effectively against them. So we've got a concern on offensive line. We've got a question mark at the quarterback position. Now, I think Ohio State's got to swerve their identity a little bit in the way they call this game versus the way they called the Tennessee game. They're facing the number 8 run defense in the country. They're facing the number 12 pressure rate defense in the country. So when I watched them, and when all of you watched Ohio State play Michigan, you probably thought to yourself the same thing I thought, which is, man, they look like they're just trying to lean on Michigan. They look like they want to be the bully against Michigan. Uh-oh, it's not working. Why are they continuing to stick with that? Help, pull the nose up. Done. They lose. I do not expect a duplicate performance here. So that means you have to look at Jeremiah Smith. You have to look at Tate. You have to look at Egbuka. You have to say, we recruited these guys for a reason. It's in our best interest to utilize them much more effectively than we did or even we even tried to do against Michigan. And that's how we got to go about things. They counted on leaning on Michigan, and it didn't work. They cannot count on leaning on Tennessee here, nor should they. It is not the way this roster is built. It is not the way the current roster with the offensive line injuries are built, and it's not what the matchup dictates. So they've got to count on the wide receiver position here. I know that in spring, they may have fancied themselves leaning a different way identity-wise, but the reality of the situation is it doesn't look like you're ready to do that. And if you're ready to do it, Are you really telling me that the style of offense that failed to beat Michigan is about to beat Tennessee and Oregon and Texas and Georgia? I don't think so. So we got to be gearing up, although we're trying to win a game here. We got to be gearing up to make a run here. I mean, you're Ohio State, so you're supposed to be competing for a national championship. Tennessee, if I'm painting this picture for you, if I'm painting the concept that you really need to be more effective throwing the ball, you really need to utilize those wide receivers more here. Tennessee faced one really, really legit passing offense this year with pro-caliber players at quarterback and, maybe some late-round guys at receiver. That was Georgia. Carson Beck went for 347 against them. I stood on the sideline and watched it. He added some on the ground as well. I do not think that Will Howard is the caliber of passer that Carson Beck is, but for broad strokes purposes, just thinking about the skill that you have on this team, you ought to be able to throw the ball. You ought to be able to have some consistency. You've got to be able to have some consistency throwing the ball. Tennessee's offense, in theory, to me, is the kind of offense that could make a run and win this whole thing. As tough as the draw is, if you think about Tennessee's offense in theory, you got a big-armed quarterback. You've got some really, really good skill out wide. Dylan Sampson Jr. leads the SEC in rushing. And then complementarily, is that a word? Yeah, I think so. You've got a really, really good run defense, really good pressure defense. So that helps the offense. Tennessee's offense, in theory, sounds great to me. This is also the same team that's been shut out in multiple first halves this year. This is the offense that stalled after getting up 10-0 against Georgia. So they're 60th in explosive plays. To me, in theory, they bludgeon you on the ground, then they kill you over the top. In reality, they're 60th in explosive plays. They're 73rd in explosive passes. And I got one of the best defenses in the country here with home field at their back. Temperature's going to be in the 20s during this game. Is this where I see Tennessee's ceiling game? I think it's a little discombobulated to try and predict that that's going to happen here. It certainly could. But is it realistic to expect a team that hasn't really given me that game for 4 quarters all year to just pop it in Columbus, Ohio in the first round of the playoffs? We'll see. If they do, they'll win the game. If Tennessee does that, they'll beat Ohio State. These are the number 1 and number 3 offenses in terms of touchdowns allowed. Number 1 and number 3 defenses in terms of offensive touchdowns allowed. Not a ton of opportunity in the game. So you got to capitalize on it. Ohio State's offense is much better than Tennessee in the red zone. I will say that. It's one thing that jumps out. But all this can be negated if Ohio State's mentality is shot. I go back to 2 years ago because this is all I know to do. Ohio State loses to Michigan. Ohio State goes to the playoff. They play, in my estimation, the best game they played all year against Georgia. They lost. They missed a field goal at the end. They lost, but they played at an insanely high level. If Ryan Day is able to pull that out of his team this year, following the gut-wrenching loss to Michigan, they'll win this game. I don't know if they'll win the whole thing, but they will beat Tennessee if they're able to do that. If Tennessee gets their ceiling game and Ryan Day gets an A- or better level performance out of Ohio State, well, then you could look at the game of the year in the playoffs in round 1. Colin, let's take a look at what the model thinks on this thing. I've got FanDuel right now hanging Ohio State minus 7.5. The model is bigger on Ohio State. The model has Ohio State minus 9. I slightly disagree with the model. I think that Tennessee is very competitive here. There are more than a few paths where I could just pick Tennessee to win this game outright. So I think desperation is very important. I trust Ohio State to handle the prep the right way. I trust Ohio State to come out the right way. I trust Ohio State to utilize their passing game more the right way than they did against Michigan, but I don't trust them enough to lay those points. So anything over a touchdown, which I'm getting right now, I'm going to take Ohio State to win and Tennessee to cover. Some people would call that a cop-out. I call it a pick on a football game. Notice I didn't bet any of my money on it. It's not on the Ramen Noodle Express, but that's where I'm landing on that game. I will be there in person, in living color, bundled up in 17 layers, because after all, I did grow up in west central Georgia to watch it all. I grew up in the other Columbus.